Build ship, build ship, build ship. That's all I've been hearing from y'all lately. And now we're going to dive in and start our tutorial on how to use BuildShip to create APIs for your application. But before I jump in, I want to cover APIs fundamentally so that you understand what an API is, how an API works, so that when you're using an API builder like BuildShip, you know what's going on under the hood and you're not treating it like magic. That's why myself and my team have been so successful using no-code tools like FlutterFlow and BuildShip is because we've come from over 30 years of combined experience building full stack software by hand. And that's why I think we have an advantage in using these tools. So before we go on, I'm going to give you that advantage by jumping in just for 2 minutes and giving you an insight into what an API is at the fundamental level. So let's jump in and explore what is an API. All right, so APIs are the building blocks of the internet. They're responsible for handling the underlying business logic of an application. And in layman terms, what that means is when you click a button on an application, you are triggering an API request to a server. So your front end is talking to another server via an API request. Think of an API request as a waiter at a restaurant. Your waiter comes to your table, and the table is your front end. The front end tells the waiter what they want to order. In this case, it's a piece of data. The waiter goes to the back end, which is the back of the restaurant, the cook, tells the cook what to make, and then brings that food back to the front end. So an API is the waiter. It's the vehicle between a front end and the server, which is handling the data. Okay, so the server is responsible for accepting the request, such as the order, processing the data, and then returning the data back to the front end. As mentioned in my previous video about BuildShip, your API normally is responsible for getting that data, but nowadays with no-code tools like FlutterFlow, we're integrating Firebase Firestore or Supabase directly into our front end. So our front end is becoming coupled with the data. However, traditionally, we would be using APIs to manipulate that data. And now with a tool called BuildShip, we're able to actually manipulate that data using a backend decoupled service so that we can tap into triggers, and we'll get into that more later. But what you need to know for the purpose of this lesson is that your server is responsible for accepting the request, processing the data, and returning the data back to the front end. Cool? Now, let's talk about the various types of API requests. So there are a handful of API request types out there, like GET, POST, PUT, PATCH, or DELETE. The two most common types of requests are GET and POST. Okay, GET requests are used to read data from a service. POST requests are used to input and manipulate data or change data from a service. So think of it this way. If you just need to get data to show on your front end, like say you're building a store, an e-commerce store, and you want to get a list of all the products that are supposed to render on your front end, you would likely be creating a GET request. And your GET request would be like get products, okay? But say you wanted to order a product. That would likely be a POST request because you're passing in input, you're changing something on the back end, and then rendering that data back out to the front end. That would be a POST request, and that would likely be something like POST order, right? Because you're ordering a product. And the order API would accept a product as input so that your backend knows what product is being purchased, and then it would manipulate the data and return it back to your front end, right? So when you're using APIs, APIs are handling the data and then returning that data back to the front end. But how does the front end know what type of data to show? Well, that's because APIs return normally 3 types of data: JSON, HTML, and then the old school one is called XML. And honestly, nobody really uses XML anymore, so you probably won't even see it. I've been a developer for 10 years and I've never really seen XML used, so let's ignore that. So when a front end makes an API request, it can receive the data as HTML, and HTML, as y'all may know, is used to render websites. So if the front end receives HTML, browsers are smart enough to know to render the HTML as a web page. Okay, and then if the browser receives JSON, then it's the application's job to pick apart that JSON object and place the data on the front end. So the next concept we need to understand is an API endpoint. So an API endpoint or a request endpoint is the URL that identifies the API that you want to interact with. Okay, so think of an API endpoint as like an address to a store. Like just like you need to know the store's address To find it and buy what you need to know an API endpoint address so that you can access the data or the resource that you want to interact with. For example, I have an API endpoint here, and you may recognize it looks just like a URL because API endpoints are URLs. If you know anything about the internet, you know that the internet is just a distributed network of a bunch of computers, and each computer or server has its own address or URL. So this URL is the address of a server somewhere, and the server could be on AWS, it could even be on BuildShip, it could be on Heroku or Firebase Cloud Functions. There's so many places that you can have servers. So this URL is called https dadjokes.p.rapidapi.com/random/joke. So we can tell this is probably an API to get some dad jokes, and then this /random is kind of the action or the noun that we are dealing with. So we can kind of put it together. This is probably an API to get random jokes. And typically when you write your own APIs, you want to write them in a convention that makes sense. So if somebody just reads your API endpoint, they could probably piece together what the API is. Okay, so now I'm at Google Chrome, and what I'm going to do is open up my developer tools by hitting F12 on my keyboard. I'm going to navigate to my network tab, and this tab is where you debug all API requests that your application is making. So I'm going to open up my network tab, and then I'm going to hit all just to show all the requests that this application is making to external servers. And you can do this too. I'm going to go to google.com and just say google.com and hit enter. Now watch my network tab here. My network tab is just populated because it's making a bunch of requests to external services. Most of these are APIs. So google.com is talking to a bunch of APIs. So I'm going to just tap on this one to see what it's doing. The first one right here, google.com. Notice here we have a request URL, which is your endpoint, right? So https google.com is an endpoint, and notice the request method is get. So we're actually making a get request to an endpoint, and the status code is 200. However, this one is saying it's moved permanently, which probably means it's just redirecting me to www.google.com. So I'm just going to follow this next one here. Notice the status code is 200, and status codes are part of API requests that tells you the output status of an API. Like, was it a good API call? Was it a bad API call? Was there an error? And we'll get into status codes a little bit more. We have an entire module on it in our Dreams into Apps course. But status codes are a great way of understanding what's going on underneath the hood as the output of an API. But okay, let's move forward. So we have status code here, and now if we go to response, we're going to see what the API actually returned us. And what do you know? This looks like an HTML document. If you scroll all the way down, you're going to notice there's some CSS, and pretty much looks like there's everything we need to render this exact HTML page that you're seeing here. So this HTML that was returned by google.com is simply just to render a web page here. So awesome. Now you know that you've been making GET requests like your entire life. Every time you go on an application and you render data, you're making a GET request. Let me show you another version of this. Let's head over to MBA.com, okay? And I'm going to refresh this page and clear all of the data in my network tab. And I'm going to refresh NBA.com/players. Okay, and now we're making a bunch of API requests. I'll let it settle for a second. And then I'm going to grab this API right here. And I'm just guessing. You can probably click through each one of these and see exactly what's going on. But I'm just going to guess that because it says player index, this is probably an API that's important, that's potentially rendering all these players. So cool. So how is the front end rendering this data that's coming back from the API? Well, let's take a look at what the API actually sent us back. So if we click on response, you'll notice that we actually have a response type of JSON. And you can actually see that sometimes by scrolling down in your preview, and notice that this is actually a JSON object. We have keys and values. So we go over JSON objects as well in the course, and there's actually another, it's actually part of the free course that we have at Ambitious Labs. So when you go to the website and log into our lab dash, you're actually going to see a free course in there called Intro to No Coding, and there's a whole lesson on there of what JSON objects are. So this JSON object is simply just a bunch of key value pairs, right? And so if I go to this result set and I drop this down, you'll notice that there's a bunch of data here. And if I drop down this row set, it looks like there's a bunch of data about players. And what do you know? I found a bunch of players here, right? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and a bunch of others. So if I drop one of these down, notice that these are actually representations of individual players. What this API returned me is an array. And in computer science, an array is a data type used to organize a list. And of course, in this use case, we would want a list, right? Because this is a list of all players. So what this API has returned me is a list of all players in the NBA. And what the front end is doing is it's using loops or map data from list if you're using FlutterFlow, and it's mapping each one of these list objects onto the front end. Okay, so that's how applications work. You make a request to a backend, the backend gets you the data, sends you either HTML or JSON to the front end, and then your job as the front end developer is just to take the JSON and map it to the front end. It's not so bad. As long as you understand how to design business logic, where to get the data from, it's not so bad. So this is why BuildShip is going to come in handy, because now that you know these fundamentals, we can head over to BuildShip and start constructing an API call, right? So here's me at BuildShip, and this is pretty much a blank editor of how an API call is constructed. So let's kind of start from scratch here, and let's pretend that we are building an API for an AI teacher, okay? So how would we do that? Well, first, on a blank BuildShip project, we'll tap on Add Trigger, and we have a few different triggers here. The one I want to focus on today is a REST API call, because we are learning how to make an API call from a front end to BuildShip, so BuildShip can process the data and return it back to the front end. Okay, so let's click on REST API call and tap Add Trigger. We're going to build an AI teacher. Okay, an AI teacher is going to take in, maybe a topic for a lesson, and it's going to return to the front end some data about the lesson. Okay, so let's create an API call that says, /generate lesson. And since we're going to take in data from the front end, and we're going to make some updates via an API call to ChatGPT, and for this exercise, for our AI teacher, we're going to have two APIs, because I want to demonstrate to you get and I want to demonstrate to you post. The first API is going to be a get request that will render to the front end a list of topics for lessons. So if we want to just render data to the front end, what type of API do we need? A get API, right? So let's change this method to get, and then let's say /topics, okay? And then what we're going to do is add another node here, and we are going to use this node to organize some data and send that data to the front end. Cool, so we've created that get request, and now we just need to return some data to the front end. So in this return node, we have status code 200, which means the API was successful, and then we're going to manually set some values here. Okay, so I'm going to open up this editor, and I'm going to send back a JSON object, because as you know, front ends require JSON to parse and show on the front end. So I'm going to open up a JSON object here, and then I'm going to say topics with a colon, and I'm going to set this to an array, and I'm going to say math, English, and we'll say physics, and that's it, okay? So that's going to be the JSON response that this API is going to send back to my front end. So let's go ahead and test this out, shall we? Tap play, and notice a couple familiar things. We have an endpoint URL, which is the location of our API. So this endpoint URL is what our front end is going to call upon to render data back to the front end. And notice you have query, body, and headers. And we go into this a little bit more in another lesson, but query is essentially the same thing that you saw back over at the MBA.com example. The headers that we had here inside of our endpoint URL, where we had college, country, draft pick, draft year, these are called query parameters. Query parameters are a fancy word for inputs. Like, think of the word query. Query means question, and parameters is a way to describe like boundaries for input, right? So these are known as query parameters, and BuildShip even has a way to input query parameters. I'm just going to give you a quick example. Like, since we have college equals, we could actually say college, and then we could say like Stanford, right? And that's how we would actually send data to a get API and use that input to maybe use it as filters. But I'm not going to do that for now. What I want to just do is I want to test to see that this API call works. I'll hit test workflow, and let's see where we get. Nothing. Maybe it's because I didn't hit ship. Let's give it a shot now. Awesome. So I hit ship and my workflow successfully deployed. Now all I got to do is copy this endpoint URL and let's just try to make a GET request directly from our browser. And that's something cool to know too. Anytime you want to make a GET request, your browser supports GET requests just off the bat. You can put any API call or any request endpoint here and hit go, and you're essentially making a GET request. You can't make post requests this way. You have to use another API client like Postman, or there's others like Swagger. I've been using Postman most of my life. But for this case, since we're making a GET request, I'm just going to run the API in my browser and look at what we got here. We actually got the API. Look how easy it was to build my own API server that returns like a fixed set of JSON. This is fantastic because now imagine this. I can consume this from a FlutterFlow application, map it to the app, and then take that data and then send it back up to another API, which I'm about to build here. So let's do that. Okay, I've created a really sample basic application in FlutterFlow just to show you guys how this is going to work. So if we go to FlutterFlow and create a new API call, I'll hit add, create API call, and I'll say get topics. We'll set the method type as get. We'll head back to BuildShip to copy that endpoint URL, bring it over here and add call. Then let's test that call, hit test API call, and boom, we got the data right here in FlutterFlow. So quickly, I'm just going to go over here, bring in a list view, drop it, and then at the page level, I'm going to do a backend query. My backend query is going to be an API call. We're going to say get topics, confirm, boom. Now we have a list view. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have a bunch of buttons on this page, and each button will map to one of the elements in our list. So one button for math, one button for English, one button for physics. And since these topics are sitting inside of an array, I can use the list view and use the render data from list function inside of FlutterFlow to render one button for each item. So watch me do that. I'll head over to the widget tree, tap on my list view, and my list view will have generate children from variable. I'm going to tap on the value, and I'm going to set that value to the get topics response. The path name we'll just set for custom, and I'll say it's dot topics because that is the key that I've set the array to. So head over here, hit dot topics, confirm, and then we'll say topic is my variable name, hit confirm, okay, and now boom, I have a bunch of buttons here. Then I'm going to set my button text to topic item, no further changes, and hit good. Now let's go ahead and test this out. All right, so my simulator finished, and look, we got 3 buttons that say math, English, physics from an API call. So now this is beautiful, right? If you go back to my previous video where I talked about being too tightly coupled, we're not tightly coupled at all. Now I could ship this app to the store, and then all I would need to change is my BuildShip API, and the data would change on the front end. I don't need to go ship another version to the App Store now because my application is fully decoupled. And this is the power of building your own APIs in BuildShip and having that decoupled application. And this is why I'm super excited about the future of no code. And we're just getting started. Within minutes, we went literally stack to stack, and we've designed some data. We've built a front end. We built an API. And this used to be stuff that literally took hundreds of lines of code to set up a API server, send it to Heroku, then connect it to the front end, deal with CORS errors. It used to be terrible. I'm telling you, like, I've built apps for 10 years and this is actually mind-boggling. Now anybody can become a full stack developer literally just by dragging and dropping and putting these things together. But it's not easy. You need to have this problem-solving mindset, and you need to be able to problem solve and think like a scientist. It's not as easy as Squarespace and Wix, but if you're able to sit down, put your mind to it, you can absolutely do this. All right, let's build one more API, right? Let's actually round this off. Let's build an API that takes in the topic and then uses the ChatGPT API to return like lesson plan ideas for teachers. Okay, so now let's build the second API call that's going to take in a topic and return an AI-generated lesson plan. So here in BuildShip, we're going to add a new workflow, tap on Add Trigger, and of course, we're going to use another REST API call, except this time, our API is going to be called /generate, and the method is going to be post. Okay, now let's add another node, and for sake of just getting this API set up, the first thing I want to do is just make sure that this API actually works. So I'm going to hit status code OK 200, and then I'm just going to ship it. And all I want to do right now is get the bare bones set up. This is a process that I like to use called incremental building, which is the idea of adding small features one at a time and, of course, testing it along the way. So cool, we have our workflow deployed. Now I'm going to copy that endpoint URL and head back to FlutterFlow. I'm going to hit add new API call, and this time I'm going to call it generate lesson. I'm going to change the method type to post to match what we have in BuildShip, and then I'm going to paste the endpoint here. Head over to the test API call tab, and I just want to make sure that we have a secure connection between FlutterFlow and BuildShip. Boom, we do, because now we have a status code 200 and we're good to keep working. The next step here is to create the connection to OpenAI to generate the AI generated lesson. So OpenAI, we're going to use the OpenAI chat module. So we'll hit add, then I'll head over to OpenAI and I'm going to create a new key. I'm going to say BuildShip November 11, and that's my second one. I'm going to hit generate key. I'm going to copy this key, and I don't really care if I show it to y'all right now because I'm going to delete it right after this. My system prompt. The system prompt, if y'all don't know, it's a prompt engineering technique where you can set kind of the context of the system. So I can say you are a lesson plan writer, you are a high school teacher. Okay. My session key, I'm going to leave that blank, and then the user request is what's actually going to be sent to the AI. So imagine you're talking to ChatGPT. That's what goes inside of user request. I'm going to say, hello teacher, you are a lesson plan writer. Write me a lesson plan for the topic of, and for now I'm just going to say science. I'm going to hard code that because I just want to make sure this is all working. Temperature we'll keep to 0.7. And for the model, we're going to choose GPT-4. For the return value, let's just hit the edit. We'll go to OpenAI chat. We're just going to send this entire OpenAI chat object, and we'll go ahead and hit ship. Beautiful. Once that's done, we'll head back to FlutterFlow just to make sure this is working. We'll go ahead and test the API call, and hopefully we should get a response from OpenAI. Boom, and we got the response. Awesome. So the status is 200, and then we have a JSON object here that says output, and then there's a lesson plan with some data. Yes, let's go. Keep moving. All right, the next step now is to map this data to our front end and be able to take that input from the front end, send it to BuildShip, and then respond back with the dynamic output. Beautiful. So let's go to our front end, and what we'll do is we'll add an action. So what's going to happen is we will add an action. We'll say API call. We'll make an API call as soon as this is working. We'll set the call name to generate lesson. We'll make sure that we can actually send some data. So we'll add body. We'll go to JSON. We'll make sure that we can actually send a key called topic with a colon. And then what we'll do is we'll make sure that we have a variable that can accept that topic. The variable type will be string. We can hit save, and then now inside of our body we'll be able to drag and drop the topic into our API call. Gorgeous. Beautiful. So now we can go to the front end and actually wire those things up. We'll go back to Action Flow Editor. Now we have the variables available to us. We'll hit topic, and then the value will be the actual button that we clicked on. So we'll hit topic item, no further changes because that topic item was the same item that we were mapping from the generate children from list. And now the topic is going to get sent to the API when we tap on it from the front end. So what I'll do now is I need to set up my API to accept that input. So we don't have the ability to do that yet. So what I'm going to do is click on this I'm going to click on edit here. Click here, edit. Beautiful. And we actually don't have any configuration set up for param. So I'm going to hit a new param, go new input. Here we're going to say topic, params, new param. Here we're going to say the key is topic, and we're just going to say the label is topic. Type is string, and we definitely need to make this a required field because we don't want to send any API request without the topic. I'm going to hit save, and now notice that we have the ability to send in a topic. Now I'm going to type in the word physics, And just to test to make sure that we can take this topic and inject it inside the user request, I'm going to edit this here. I'm going to surround it in backticks. Well, here, I'm going to let BuildShip handle that. Now I'm going to go topic of colon. I'm going to remove science, and variables, I'm going to say request. And then we should be able to say body. Okay, and we can say body dot topic. Boom. And now that will accept topic and inject it. And at this point, we should be good to go. Let's hit ship. Awesome. So it looks like that's working. And now I can go back to FlutterFlow. And now let's test to see if this API is actually accepting some input. So we'll go to the API call. And now we should actually be able to test variables too, because we had set up our variables for the generate lesson API. Cool. So we'll hit response and test. And now you see here that in our tester, we have the variable of topic available. Now let's try like history, hit test API call. And hopefully if this all goes well, we should be able to see that our AI is now taking in input from our front end, and we should be able to generate dynamic output that way. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so it's still saying scientific method, which means it's considering science. Let's find out why. Okay, so we sent in variables. Boom. Let's see, the body is now topic history. Let's make sure that our API is actually accepting the body, right? So if we go to user request, hit edit. So it doesn't look like we had actually injected that. Maybe BuildShip messed up. So what we'll do is we will go variable topic of colon variables request body, and we'll say body dot, because dot notation is how you access key values. So we'll say body dot topic. Okay, boom, it looks like it liked that. And then we'll say ship. And let's see how this goes. I'm super excited because we're moving so fast. Okay, test API call back at FlutterFlow. And we should see a history-based lesson plan. Boom, and we did. We got a history lesson plan. Awesome. The next step is to actually trigger this from the front end. So what's going to happen is when you click on this button, we're sending the topic, and now if the API succeeds, we can add an action for alert dialog, hit informational dialog, and let's just say output, and the message will be get topics, not get topics response, but we're going to have the API response. So we'll say action outputs, API results, we'll say JSON body and JSON path, and then our JSON path is actually dot output, and boom, let's hit confirm. And now let's make sure we can run our app. I think we have an issue here. API topic value is not set, so we'll hit topic item, confirm. Boom, so that should subside there. Now let's test our FlutterFlow application, and if this all goes well, we would have just built a very basic AI lesson plan generator for teachers using FlutterFlow and BuildShip, fully decoupled within literally 20 minutes. So let's do this. Awesome, so our app is done running, and now it's the moment of truth. Let's tap math, and let's see if we get a lesson plan back for math. Let's go! We did it! We built a full stack app in literally 20 minutes using FlutterFlow and BuildShip, fully decoupled. I'm stoked. Honestly, you don't know how stoked I am. I get so lit off this because I've spent years writing code by hand, trying to build these API integrations myself, and now we've integrated full AI integrated application, because now we've integrated AI without having to write a single line of code. And so that's the beauty of BuildShip. Now we can just keep adding nodes and keep adding more business logic without having to do anything to our FlutterFlow application. And for those of y'all who have been building with FlutterFlow before, you know that sometimes it can be a pain to have to debug and figure out where things are falling apart in your APIs and your action chain. But now we don't have to do that anymore. This is absolutely awesome. I hope if you followed along that you also got the same output, and from here you can progressively build on more functionality, and the sky is the limit. I hope you enjoyed, and if you want to build your app idea with me, come hang out at Ambitious Labs. We have a free Discord community. Head over to our website at Ambitious Labs, and you'll tap on our free resources at the top of the page, and you'll notice that we have a free no-code training, a Discord community, and of course, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to have a lot more content on FlutterFlow and BuildShip because the world of startups is quickly changing, and the future is no-code, and the future is now. So I'll see you soon. Join the Discord community, and I hope to see you in our next lesson. Take care.